Hey everybody, so we are moving into chapter 22, which is the respiratory system. Our plan for this series of lectures, we're going to talk about the functional anatomy of the respiratory system, so the respiratory system as a whole, and then we'll talk about the different structures within the respiratory system. Then we'll move into the mechanisms of breathing, talking about different pressures and a few laws. The laws are down by the gas exchange, but more about in terms of mechanism breathing, pressures, pulmonary ventilation, factors that will affect pulmonary ventilation, respiratory volumes, and functional pulmonary functional tests. Then we get into gas exchange, how exchange going to occur between our blood and our lungs and blood and our tissue. We'll talk about, these is where we'll talk about two specific laws. We'll talk about internal and external respiration. Then we get into talking about how we transport our respiratory gases in the blood. As we move into this area here relies heavily on our understanding of pH, and really from here on down, understanding how we control that process of respiration using more importantly, understanding how pH is measured, and we'll learn about how our respiratory system plays a critical role in regulating our pH. Sorry, I was trying to get my drawing situated and couldn't do two things at once. We'll move into control of respiration, some neural mechanisms, as well as factors that influence breathing and rate. We'll talk about just one respiratory adjustment, which is at high altitude. Your book goes into a little bit more, and then we'll end with some homeostatic imbalances of the respiratory system. So here's our objectives list. Again, making sure you guys are looking at the objectives list as you guys prepare for your quizzes and your exams. So the respiratory system, the major function of the respiratory system is obviously respiration. So the respiratory system is going to supply the body with oxygen so that we can carry out cellular respiration. It's also going to allow us to dispose of carbon dioxide, which is a byproduct or a waste product of cellular respiration. So again, the whole purpose of the respiratory system, and the reason why we always say you can't survive without oxygen, is because without oxygen you can't carry out this very vital and important process which is required for ATP. When we look at the processes of respiration, it's actually broken down into kind of 4 processes, and we've talked about some of these already because we've talked about our cardiovascular system or the circulatory system. So there's a really nice relationship between the respiratory system and the circulatory system when it comes to these processes of respiration. So when we look at, for example, the respiratory system, within the respiratory system, our first process is this notion of pulmonary ventilation, which is just breathing, right? We breathe in, we breathe out, we breathe in, we breathe out, right? This kind of cyclic process of air movement. Now, in addition to our respiratory system serving as this mechanism of air movement, the respiratory system will also carry out what's known as external respiration. Okay, so external respiration is the exchange of gases, whether it be oxygen and or CO2, okay, between the lungs and the blood. So what we're going to learn is there is an exchange. So these are our lungs, okay, and we have our cells down here, okay, and when we think about our blood, I'm just going to kind of draw this as a loop. Okay, so this is our blood circulating. Okay, through our body. Okay, so when we talk about this external respiration, it's the exchange that's going to occur here and here. Okay, so this is what we're referring to when we talk about external respiration. Now, in terms of the respiratory system, okay, we kind of now return and we rely on the circulatory system to carry out the rest of the processes, which is transportation, okay, which is carbon dioxide and CO2 are going to be transported in the blood. And then we're going to rely on the cardiovascular system for internal respiration to occur. Now, internal respiration is the exchange of oxygen and CO2 at our blood tissue exchange site, okay? So external is from lungs to blood. Internal is from tissue to blood. Okay, so when we talk about internal respiration, this is the site that we're talking about. Now again, you can't have respiration as a whole without having both of these systems at play. So when we look at the respiratory systems, the major organs of the respiratory system are the nose, we have our nasal cavity, our oral cavity, our paranasal sinuses. As we move down, we go into our pharynx and then our larynx, our trachea, our right and left bronchi, our main bronchi, and then these then go out and branch substantially, and eventually we get into our lung tissue and our alveoli. So we're going to briefly just talk about these various structures and the role that these various structures play in moving air to the alveoli. Now, before we do that, they often break down the respiratory system into two zones. One is our respiratory zone and one is our conducting zone. So respiratory zone is where gas exchange is actually going to occur. So it is going to be kind of the end of the branching system where we have, for example, our respiratory bronchioles or alveolar ducts and our alveoli. Again, where that exchange can occur. Our conducting zone is just that. It is going to be the conduit or the tube system that gets the air to the respiratory system, okay, or the respiratory zone. So all the structures prior to our respiratory bronchioles would be considered our conducting zone. Okay? So a big function of all of these structures, which we're going to see over the next number of slides, is that these structures are really there to cleanse, to warm, and to humidify that air. So by the time it reaches the respiratory zones, okay, it's fairly sterile. It's not super cold as that tissue is subjective, is very sensitive to temperatures. Okay, so again, the conducting zone is prior to the respiratory zone. Then we also have the diaphragm and other respiratory muscles that are part of the muscular systems, okay, aren't necessarily part of the respiratory system proper, but are very important structures of the respiratory system because they're going to promote that process of ventilation. And again, we can see down here, right, so pretty much everything prior to this terminal bronchiole, okay, depending on what books you're looking at, the terminal bronchioles will sometimes be considered a conducting zone, sometimes be considered a respiratory zone. For the sake of this lecture, I usually consider the terminal bronchiole as part of the respiratory zone, but everything above that or everything prior to that is going to be conducting zone. Okay, so all of your respiratory bronchioles in terms of your primary, secondary, tertiary bronchioles, your main bronchi, your trachea, and up are all going to be conducting zone. So looking at the first structure that air is going to encounter as it enters into our respiratory system, we have our nose and our paranasal sinus. Obviously, when we talk about the nose, it's divided into an internal and an external nose, or an internal nasal cavity and external nose. Again, I could probably leave these slides completely out and you guys would know what the function of the nose is, right? It's going to provide an airway for respiration. Here comes our common theme, which is going to filter, moisten, and warm the air as it enters into our respiratory system. It serves as a resonating chamber for speech, right? You can plug your nose and it sounds very different, right? Okay, so this tells us that this is a resonating chamber for speech. It's also going to house our olfactory receptors or our receptors for smell. So it has a whole bunch of functions besides its role in the respiratory kind of proper system in terms of what we think about is in terms of getting air into our lungs. Our paranasal sinuses, we actually have 4 paranasal sinuses. We have our frontal, we have our sphenoid, okay, we have our ethmoid, which I don't think you can see on here, no, as well as our maxillary sinuses. So you can kind of think about them, right? We have our frontal and our sphenoids inside and our ethmoids inside, and then our maxillary, which is the ones kind of here. When you're sick, right, you can kind of feel, sometimes you can feel pressure. Some people talk about sinus headaches or sinus pressure, and that's because we have these paranasal sinuses, which are basically just cavities within the skull structure. One function of those sinuses is actually to lighten the weight of the skull. But we're also going to have mucus secreted from the paranasal sinuses, and although we associate mucus as a bad thing, right, mucus is actually something that's going to help us trap and clean the air, or trap pathogens and microorganisms and dust particles, and clean that air as it comes through. It's also going to help warm and moisten the air as well. So again, we're going to see this common theme with our conducting zone structures as we move through the respiratory system. So we go through our nose, again, our paranasal sinuses contribute to that cleansing, and then we move down into the pharynx. Now the pharynx is just a long muscular tube that basically runs from the base of the skull down to about C6, okay, cervical vertebrae number 6. And its major function is just to connect our nasal cavity and the mouth to the larynx and the esophagus, okay? So this pharynx, okay, serves as actually not only just a passageway for air, but also for food as well. And so this can be divided down into 3 regions. We have our nasopharynx, because it is associated with the nasal cavity. We have the oropharynx, because it's associated with the oral cavity. And we have the laryngeal pharynx, because it's associated with the larynx. Okay? So again, these divisions, if you think about where they're located, okay, you should be able to identify those 3 different locations. Again, we come back to these 3 different structures in the digestive system, because right now we're talking about the air component of the pharynx. In the digestive system, we'll talk about the food component, or the role of the pharynx. Okay? From our pharynx, we move down and we enter into our larynx. Okay? And the larynx is really this kind of structure right through here is our larynx. Okay? And what it does is it attaches our hyoid bone, right, our floating bone right here, which is located right here, it attaches, it's an anchor point for a hyoid bone, which tends to just float, but it's a conduit or a passageway for air from our pharynx into our lower structure, the trachea. So as air comes in, right, air is going to come in, right, comes down our nasopharynx, past our oral pharynx, and again, air can come through and through our oral pharynx. It's going to come down through the laryngeal pharynx, excuse me, through the larynx, and then down into the trachea. Okay, so our larynx does a few things. One, it provides a patent airway. Okay, anytime you see patent, this just means an open. Okay, open airway. Okay, it's going to be responsible for routing air and food into their proper channels. So this structure right here, called the epiglottis. Okay, as we swallow. Okay, so again, I just showed you how air comes in. This little epiglottis, as we swallow, will actually flap close, protecting the airway, so that when food comes in, it diverts down into the esophagus as opposed into our airway. Now, every once in a while, we choke on our spit, we choke on food, whatever it may be, and usually that's a spasm to the epiglottis, where it doesn't completely close, or it has a little kind of twitch that allows substances to go down into our trachea. In addition to kind of rerouting our food particles or our air to the proper channels, the larynx is also the site of voice production. So this houses our vocal cords or vocal folds. So when we look, so this is a sagittal view of that region. If we look at a frontal view, we can see now here's that hyoid bone, which is this structure, this little bone structure here. And we can see that it's comprised of a whole bunch of membranes, but more importantly, a whole bunch of cartilages. Okay, this laryngeal prominence right here, this kind of structure right here, okay, this is often referred to as the Adam's apple. And it sits it's more predominant in men, or it's very typically predominant in men, not so much in women. When we look at, when we look a little bit further at the larynx and their role in the production of sound, what we can see is the following. So what you're looking at here is someone has taken a camera and put it up through the nasal cavity and basically gone down. And what they're looking at here, so here is that epiglottis structure here. Okay, so here again is the epiglottis, okay, depending on whether the glottis is open or closed. Okay, and basically, okay, our vocal cords, or what we call actually vocal folds, are created by a group of ligaments. Okay, and when we look at this structure here, okay, these right here, these two structures right here are those two ligaments. Okay, so those open and close, those ligaments open and close, producing different sound pitches, so on and so forth. Okay, so when this is open, okay, the hole that's created is known as the glottis. Okay, the opening between our vocal folds. Now, again, these folds will vibrate as air rushes in and out, creating the sound that you guys are all hearing as I talk. Okay, now, in addition to those vocal folds, okay, or vocal cords, you also have a structure known as a vestibular fold. These are referred to as false vocal cords because they look very similar and they're going to move in a very similar kind of fashion to our vocal folds. However, the role of these vestibular folds, and they lie just outside, so they're kind of this region here and this region here when the glottis is closed, and this region here and this region here when it's open. Okay, it has no role in sound production. However, when we swallow, or typically when we swallow, what's going to happen is as those vocal folds come together, okay, to close that glottis, the vestibular folds will kind of close over the top of them as well, because they serve kind of as a safeguard to prevent food stuff from getting down there. And again, in addition to that, the epiglottis will kind of lay over the top of this as well, trying to redivert that food stuff down the esophagus and not down into the trachea. So that brings us now down into our trachea. So this region here down is our trachea, also known as the windpipe. And it runs from the larynx all the way down to the mediastinum, where the trachea then branches into the primary bronchi. The trachea is comprised of a pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. If you go back to AMP1, this is that epithelium that looks like it's stratified because the nucleus appear to be stacked. However, every cell touches the basement membrane. And also, and it's hard to see here, you might be able to see it a little bit better in your book, has these really beautiful cilia associated with the apical surface of this epithelium. And the function of these cilia, again, is to kind of clean the air as it comes through. But it's also there to help move the mucus up the trachea, so that as it comes up and comes out, we actually swallow that mucus that's actually cleaning the air as it enters into our lungs. I am not sick. I have something in my throat. So again, we can see this cross section here is the trachea. Here is the esophagus, which is our food tube, which is going to transport food down into the stomach. So the trachea, again, is an airway passage that cleans and warms and moistens our incoming air. Again, we see this common theme. So as we get down this structure, here's our trachea, right? Our trachea is missing, well, you have just a little nub left here, but our trachea would be located up here. As that air comes down, what we see is we see this primary bronchi that branches, that we can see that same structure here as it branches. Now, as you branch into that right and left primary bronchi, you actually have substantial branching that occurs. You have about 23 orders of branching that will occur, and this creates something called the bronchial tree. And that's what this structure right here is something called a bronchial tree. It's kind of a really cool structure. Essentially what they have done is they've taken a pair of lungs and they have filled it with a polymer material that hardens in the area where you would normally have air. And then what they do is they remove the tissue, okay? And what you're left with is this kind of, and it actually branches even more than what you're seeing here because it just gets too small. The polymers can't get down into that smaller structure. But again, here you can see this really nice branching system. It's really, really beautiful. And they kind of differentiate the branches a little bit here with the upper branches, or the superior and the middle and then the inferior branches. When we look at the lung tissue, oh, we'll get to the lung, but actually let me just bring here because I don't know if I mentioned this later. When we look at this lung tissue, here we actually have 3 lobes on the right side and we have 2 lobes on the left, and that is because the heart sits here in the middle, slightly off to the left side. So to accommodate the heart, you kind of give up a little bit of space on the left side. So from the tip of the bronchial tree, okay, we enter into our conducting zone, or from the tips of the bronchial tree, we finish out our conducting of our respiratory zone structures, and we enter into the respiratory zone structures. Okay. Now, again, if we look at our kind of respiratory zone structures, here is that terminal bronchi I mentioned in some places. Oops, not right here, but this one here, which in some textbooks will call this part of the conducting, some textbooks will call this part of the respiratory. We're going to call this part of the respiratory structure. As this comes down, it's going to branch into our respiratory bronchioles and then our alveolar ducts as well, and then our alveolar sacs. Now, these alveolar sacs you can think of as a bunch of grapes, okay? And each individual grape represents an alveoli. So we have about 300 million alveoli that make up most of our lung tissue or our lung volume, okay? And this alveoli, or these alveoli, create what's known as the respiratory membrane. And the respiratory membrane is the interface between the alveoli and our capillaries, okay, within the blood system. Okay. Now, gas exchange between these alveoli and the capillary is going to happen via simple diffusion. Okay. So we'll talk a lot more about this notion of simple diffusion and the exchange of gases. Essentially, they're going to be going down there, as opposed to being a concentration gradient, they're going to be going down their pressure gradient, but in a way that doesn't require energy. So this will occur, the exchange of these gases will occur via simple diffusion. Whoopsie. When we look at the alveoli a little bit more in depth, what we see is the following. We have our alveolar walls, okay, and this is basically a single layer of simple squamous epithelium, okay. These are often referred to as your type 1 alveolar cells, and then scattered throughout there, you also have these little green cells right here. that are represented. There's another one here and another one here, okay? These are representing what we call our cuboid, our scattered cuboidal. These are often referred to as your type 2 alveolar cells. And we're going to come back to the importance of these here in a little while. But essentially, they're going to secrete a lipid protein called surfactant, as well as some other antimicrobial proteins. And again, we'll come back to the notion of the importance of this molecule here in a little while. In addition to the epithelial makeup of our alveoli from one grape to another also has pores. Okay, and these pores, which are kind of located here, basically serve as a conduit to equalize air pressure throughout the lung. So we want to make sure that the lung tissue is all experiencing the same pressure. So the easiest way to do that is to basically put pores throughout the alveoli so that as air comes in, it disperses out so that we have equal pressure within each alveoli. Lastly, within this alveoli, because this is an area that is going to be exposed to the external environment, you will have these little macrophages cruising around on the surface of the alveoli, keeping that alveoli sterile. To give you kind of a fun fact, okay, about 2 million dead macrophages. Oh, I spelled macro wrong, but you guys get it, phages. Essentially die per hour coming from the lungs. And what happens is these are then carried by cilia up that conducting zone to the esophagus and then swallowed. Pretty crazy, huh? Okay. Over here again, we can see the classic function of our simple squamous epithelium, and that it allows for this very, very easy, simple diffusion to occur, right? If this was a cuboidal population that made up our alveoli, it would be much harder to basically exchange these gases, okay? When we think about the blood supply to the lung, again, we have two blood supplies, okay? We have our pulmonary circulation. This is what we talked about when we talked about the flow of blood in chapter 18, right? How the right side of the heart bringing blood to the lungs so that it can be oxygenated and we can drop off CO2. So the pulmonary arteries deliver systemic venous blood to the lungs for oxygenation, okay? And the pulmonary veins are going to basically take the pulmonary blood back to the right side of the, or the left side of the heart, okay, where it's going to be sent out to the body, okay? So pulmonary circulation, again, is, when we think about it, is really our systemic, going to supply our systemic system with the oxygen that it needs. When we talk about this interface here that we see here, this is pulmonary. Okay, where that gas exchange is going to be occurring. Now, and just like the heart that needs a coronary system to supply the muscle of the heart with its oxygen, the lungs are the same way. So the lungs do not get their oxygen, the lung tissue does not get its oxygen out of the pulmonary system. Instead, the lung tissue itself, okay, gets oxygenated by the bronchial arteries. So this is another artery that branches off the base of the aorta, and then it enters the lung at the hilum or the hilum, and that kind of structure, so if you kind of look at the lung, oh, this is a horrible lung. There's like an indentation a little bit on the lung, and this is where basically your blood supply, your nerves, and everything enter into that lung tissue. This is unlike the pulmonary circulation, which is a low pressure, high volume. This is under the guide or under the direction of the left side of the heart. So this is going to be a high pressure, low volume environment because it's going to be coming off of that left side of the heart. We'll be moving on to mechanisms of breathing in the next lecture.